Sebastian Bell says that Chinese EVs are a huge threat to Western automakers simply because people can actually afford them. JTO Dynamics has given us some data along with another research company, guys, which shows what's really happening in the electric car market worldwide. There's a big gap. There's a huge gap between the price of electric cars made in China versus cars made outside of China. The reality is EVs made in China are affordable. People can actually afford them. EVs not made in China are much more expensive. And to give you an idea on just how big this gap is, Ford's losing $36,000 on every EV it sells. It was $32,000 the quarter before that, $26,000 before that. The gap appears to be growing and not decreasing. We thought the gap would decrease, right, between making EVs in China versus, say, the US or Europe. But unfortunately, the gap appears to simply be growing. Here are the numbers. Here's the actual evidence showing how big of a problem this really is. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the channel. I'm Sam Evans. You're watching the Electric Viking. Welcome to all the new subscribers. Welcome back, everyone else. Chinese EVs are a very big threat to Western automakers. Well, because people can actually afford them. The average Chinese EV costs less than half as much as the average American or European EV. Now, it's worth keeping in mind, there's not really many premium EVs being sold that are made in China in the West. So this is really, it's not a fair comparison because it's comparing cheaper EVs, lower kind of spec EVs versus higher spec EVs. But the point is still really very accurate. If you want to buy an electric car in the United States, the cheapest option costs more than twice as much as the least expensive internal combustion vehicle on the market. If you want to buy a new EV in China, the most affordable option costs 9% less than the cheapest internal combustion vehicle available to you. So the cheapest EVs in China are cheaper than the cheapest gasoline-powered cars. But outside of China, it's the opposite. This is a sign, says Car Scoops, of the price gap that keeps growing wider in the automotive industry, while the EVs being sold by legacy automakers in the US, Europe, and elsewhere still cost more than their internal combustion counterparts. In China, anyone can afford an EV, and the reality is in China, EVs and gasoline or diesel, petrol-powered cars, whatever you want to call them, they're at price parity. They've been at price parity now for probably about a year. In the first half of 2023, the average EV cost $70,462 US. $70,462 US in Europe. That's the average sale price in Europe. The average in the United States that people paid for EVs was $71,683. Now, those prices are coming down. There's no question they're coming down. They're still too high, though. This is according to data from JTO Dynamics. By contrast, the average EV in China sold at a price of $32,842. And those numbers in China do include very premium, high-priced EVs. There's a lot of them. A lot of companies like NIO and others make very expensive premium EVs. So we don't hear much about here, but they are sold in China in pretty significant numbers. Now, if you would look at the comparison here, right, this chart is really interesting. This comes from JTO Dynamics. It shows you the average price in US dollars in 2023 this year for a Chinese EV versus a non-Chinese branded EV. In Australia, the difference is enormous. The average price in Australia for a Chinese EV is $37,400. That's US dollars, by the way. Keep that in mind, US dollars, these numbers. So if you're thinking, that's wrong, there's no EVs in Australia for $37,000, of course, US dollars there are though. So $37,464 US is the average transaction price for an EV in Australia. The average for a non-Chinese is $78,000. So that's literally double. In fact, it's actually more than double. What about China? Well, the average price in China for a Chinese branded EV is $25,947. The average price for a non-Chinese brand EV was $58,000. More than double. Europe, pretty similar story. $51,000 for a Chinese EV, $71,000 for a non-Chinese EV. India, $27,000 for a Chinese EV, $58,000 for a non-Chinese EV. Israel, $60,000 for a Chinese EV, $125,000 for a non-Chinese EV. Japan, $30,000 or $29,600 for Chinese EVs versus $67,000 for a non-Chinese EV. Latin America, $49,000 for Chinese EVs versus $106,000 for non-Chinese. Southeast Asia, same. In fact, the gap here is much, much wider. $33,000 for a Chinese EV versus $123,000 on average for non-Chinese. Turkey, $46,000 versus $102,000. This shows you what's happening. A number of things are going on. Obviously, range anxiety in the United States is probably encouraging automakers to invest in bigger battery packs, in particular into lithium-ion ternary batteries, not LFP batteries. And they have a little bit more range. Theoretically, day-to-day use, they don't really, because you're not meant to charge them to 100%, whereas LFP you can charge to 100%. They have a bit more range, but they're more expensive to manufacture. However, in order to conceal the cost of the battery, the majority of EVs are crossovers and SUVs and more premium type vehicles, making them, on average, more expensive. However, by contrast, less expensive battery chemistries such as LFP in China have helped drive down the cost of EVs. And the Chinese are really going after that lower cost market, that mid-price market to lower cost vehicles. That appears to be the segment here where China is really taking market share. But remember, keep in mind, the global car market of about 75 million car sales per year. 80% of those cars are non-premium. 80%. So China wants to take that 80%. They don't care about the 20%. They're more interested in the 80%. And that's the really worrying part about these numbers. Not every aspect of China's EVs is so positive though. Say, Jado Dynamics, robust unions in the US and Europe mean that workers are paid much more. In addition, well-founded reports that a large portion of China's manufacturing industry is supported by forced Uyghur labor throw into question the ethics of its success and raise alarm bells about its human cost. And I do agree that it is true that Chinese workers are paid nothing. It's part of what helps them to make EVs at such low prices. Their workers across China in the automotive industry make about an average of $16,000. In Shanghai and Beijing, it's about $22,000, but outside of those areas, it's closer to $12,000, $13,000. So it averages out at around $16,000 for workers in the automotive industry in China, which is obviously very, very, very small number in comparison to workers in the US and Europe. Production costs, though, aren't the only factor. The Chinese government has subsidized the purchase of EVs. And of course, so have other governments, but the Chinese government has been subsidizing EVs now for more than 10 years. This has helped a nascent small industry become a massive one. China's approach has been very successful at nurturing a grassroots industry that offers a wide variety of vehicles, and it's resulted in there being 91 electric car manufacturers in China. Now, a lot of those will go bankrupt probably within the next 6 months, but it's still 91 is a massive number. And what that means is they're all competing against each other. It forces innovation. It forces change for the better, usually for the better. While American consumers can choose from 51 electric models and Europeans can choose from 135, Chinese buyers can pick from 235 EVs that Jado knows about. The truth is there's hundreds more. Jado just hasn't listed them in their list. There's heaps of EVs made by companies that are not even in those 91 manufacturers lists. I've looked at them. They're actually on, if you want to see them, they're on Alibaba, they're on AliExpress. You can buy EVs from all kinds of different virtually unknown brands in all different cities all across China. So there's well over 100 electric car manufacturers with hundreds of models in total. That means that whilst there are premium vehicles on offer, there are also much cheaper vehicles. Millions of EVs have been sold in China priced below $10,000. With an eye on international markets, China's automakers are producing low-priced EVs, which are actually pretty good, surprisingly, to earn their relatively unknown brands a foothold in new markets. And those new markets may be in China, but keep in mind, if China is 33% of the entire world auto market, then that's pretty significant. That makes the average Chinese EV much cheaper than its competitors around the world, not just in China. What else does this mean? Well, it means that China is taking over the global automotive industry, and it's happening at a faster rate than what I thought it would. When I first started this channel 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, I predicted that this would happen, that policies would have to change. Otherwise, China would do this. It would take over the last bastion of manufacturing. It already owns the majority of manufacturing for everything else. The automotive industry was the last domino to fall, but it was the most important domino. It's by far the biggest employer when it comes to manufacturing, by far, and it's by far the wealthiest area of manufacturing, the most important for economies like the United States, Germany, France, and of course, even more important than all of those, for Japan. But China, well, it doesn't see things that way. It doesn't think, well, let's be fair. Let's share the wealth. China just wants to make as much as it can. And the truth is here, most of these companies are not actually state-owned. They're not actually state-owned. They're not owned by the Chinese government. Many of them have private ownership. Many of them are just individuals who got together and thought, let's start a car company. Let's make EVs for people that people can afford. So, clearly, this is working. And it's very, very scary because in Europe, the Europeans don't know what to do about this. Now, in America, of course, the chicken tax that Trump imposed a few years ago has actually turned out to be somewhat of a blessing for the North American automotive market, it's really the only market not being disrupted by Chinese EVs. But will it happen? I think it's only a matter of time. Hopefully, though, the American automotive companies such as GM and Ford, which have basically cancelled their EV plans for 2024, realize that actually, if they don't do the hard yards today, they will lose their sales tomorrow. Guys, let me know what you think on this in the comments. I mean, this is a very divisive topic here. I am not supporting China's rise here and their global hegemony. It's scary, it's worrying. I'm just pointing out what is actually happening, the reality on the ground. And I do like the fact that this does give people the option to buy cheap EVs. That's a good thing. Of course, there is a few bad things to go along with it.